Is Russia pushing everywhere except for where it needs to in Bakhmut? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It's March 11th, 2023. This is your daily Ukraine update. Let's get into it. Okay, when we look at the control map, you can see there are some significant changes in and around Bakhmut. First, from north to south, you can see Russian forces making a small advance along this roadway here outside of Orkovko-Vasilievka. It's tough to say that there's a ton of value here beyond the road itself. You can see that there are just a few tiny villages, but not really any significant urban centers or road intersections until you get to Sloviansk. So this may be just part of a Russian effort to, again, continue to push outward on this front. But this is the opposite direction that they want to go to if they want to hold Bakhmut. You can see as well, they are indeed trying to advance towards this key roadway, this I think it's H503, a key evacuation route from Bakhmut for Ukrainian forces. And while this does bring them somewhat closer, or rather, it appears to bring them about equidistant, it's not necessarily any closer. Well, it may have them a little bit close. You can see they are within about 500 meters of this road. So their goal, as we've talked about, is to deter Ukrainian forces, stop them from being able to use this road for the removal of troops and equipment from Bakhmut. But Ukrainian forces do seem to have been able to continue to keep this road open. And when we look to the south, right, we can see that there is, other than this small, again, line of territory crossing this small canal and occupying this small building here, they're still not any closer to pressuring the main route out of Bakhmut. And while this is obviously a hairy spot right here, the remainder of the roadway remains fairly clear. So the other key change, and this is probably a little late, we've talked about this for some time, is the fact that the Russian forces and the Wagner forces, they are stuck on the eastern side of the Bakhmutka. British intelligence is actually reporting that Ukrainian forces have demolished all the key bridges over the river, and that it's defined, the Bakhmutka is defined by a 500 to 800 meter strip free of buildings on either side, which means that if you wanted to cross the Bakhmutka, as you guys can see, you would end up in something of a what in military parlance we call a kill zone. And it's kind of as bad as it sounds. It's an area without cover, usually where an ambush is set up. It's the designated point where you can ambush someone. So Ukrainian forces likely set up across these buildings, both observing and with good fields of fire, able to engage any Russian forces they observe crossing. All of these, it's likely that all these bridges have been destroyed and that it's going to be pretty tough for Russian forces to make a crossing. That said, as you can see, they're still trying. Looks like there were indeed some efforts to cross, probably just probing attacks by untrained troops to determine if indeed the Ukrainians have set defensive perimeters and to check for what we call dead space, which is an area where perhaps your enemy has not effectively covered, right? A blind spot, so to speak, in their perimeter. But it's worth noting that these natural obstacles are very efficient to defend. So as long as you can have small teams with crew-served weapons sort of scattered throughout here, and as long as they can maintain observation of this river and that you have reinforcements somewhere in the city that can quickly be brought in to stop any incursion, you can actually defend with far fewer troops than, say, the north here, where you need literally a line of entrenched people virtually shoulder to shoulder in order to hold this terrain. So it means that it may result in more Ukrainian forces being freed up to ensure that H-32 and 506 remain open. And as we've talked about, right, 506 pretty close, pretty threatened right now, but H-32 probably still open. You can see Russian forces continuing again to surge forward in both of these locations, trying to increase the pressure on Ukrainian troops as they evacuate from Bakhmut. And as you can see, Russia really starting to come to the conclusion that it needs to focus on Bakhmut, where it can achieve any level of success. And it continues to try to surge in Donetsk, right? They may be making some marginal progress in encircling Avdiivka, but you guys can see that relative to places like Bakhmut, they are so far from an effective encirclement. It's almost comical. And it's one of the reasons that it's generally believed that these are DNR and LNR forces, and they're just not that capable. The other waste of time that Russia's engaged in is building defensive lines in rear areas far from the current front lines in areas in Russia that will probably never see fighting. This includes Belgorod Oblast. They literally have constructed a large defensive line of fortifications. And the governor actually is saying that Russian forces should send troops to defend this system of fortifications in the event that Ukrainian forces somehow find the manpower to invade sovereign Russia. This is, of course, preposterous, but that didn't stop the Russian officials from spending about $132 million US on this construction. They're also, of course, building fortifications along the Kursk border with Ukraine. And you may be saying, this seems like a total waste. Do they really believe this? No, it's to support the message from the Kremlin that seeks to portray Ukraine as threatening sovereign Russian territory. Therefore, making the war appear like an existential threat to Russia. Most Russians likely see, whether they admit it in polls or not, that Ukraine is not really an imminent threat to Russian sovereignty, similar to the way that most Americans did end up knew that Iraq was not an imminent threat to the United States. And that was why there were so many anti-war protests. But imagine if the Iraq War's level of casualties approached the 100,000 mark, right, as you're seeing here in Russia. Americans would be livid, furious with their elected leaders. So Russia needs to reshape the narrative to be less of a war of choice and make it look more and more like Ukraine is some imminent threat to Russia. And by building these symbolic defensive lines in places that Ukraine has absolutely no intention of going, it really helps the it helps the Kremlin sell their war to the Russian people, given its massive, massive cost. Of course, the other question on everyone's mind is this Ukrainian offensive. Again, Russian forces committed hard to trying to take Bakhmut, and it's not clear how much or at what rate this withdrawal is happening. And if, again, Ukraine needs to push while Russian forces are all in and committed elsewhere. They may realize that they're not going to be able to cross the Bakhmutka easily. They may take an operational pause. They may decommit some of their forces and reallocate them in other areas, all of which would be bad news for the timing of the counteroffensive. That sort of the best timing for this is always going to be when your enemy is at their most committed. Just like in fighting, the best counter punches are after that other boxer has extended themselves, right? If you ever see brutal UFC knockouts, a lot of the most vicious ones happen at times where you can see that the other fighter is swinging with everything they have and dropping their guard, putting their weight off center. And that's true in conventional war as well. Ukraine would do best to launch their counterstrike when Russia has committed at the maximum, the apex of their commitment to taking Bakhmut. Anyway, guys, that's all I had for you for today. Thanks, as always, for being supporters. Let's see what we can do. There we go. Let's do it like that. Thanks to all our Colonel tier patrons, Melissa Janeway, Tad Rockwell, Derek Chang, Jeremy Carroll, Thomas McLeod, EC1978, Predator 7R, Judith Haynes, Robin Colburn, all Lieutenant tier patrons. You guys make this whole thing possible. And if you want uncensored combat video breakdowns, the link to the Patreon is in the description. The new video dropped yesterday. We saw some trench warfare, some mountain warfare, some urban warfare. Just, again, the wild sort of sampling of the diversity of environments that this conflict is encompassing. See you guys in the next one.